Sundays we do Tanya, and I try very hard not to interrupt the Tanya. A lot of other things get displaced by this, that, and the other. The Tanya I don't like to move. I heard a story from one of my mashpiyim that in Lubavitch, the Seder was that every single day, hat man gesagt Tanya, the last half an hour of Seder Nigla hat man gesagt Tanya. In other words, the Seder Lubavitch was, they had 2 meals a day. They had breakfast and they had supper. The Seder started at 11:30 and it went straight till 7:30. Straight, 8 hours, straight. Chassidus was 7:30 to 9:30. Davening and breakfast was 9:30 to 11:30. An hour and a half was davening, half an hour for breakfast. Then there was 8 hours of Nigla, 11:30 till 7:30, and then 8:30 to 10:30 was Chassidus. It was 4 and 8. But the last half an hour of Seder Nigla each day, like the Mashpia Zog Tanya, the Mashpia would say Tanya. The Mashpia's name was Rabbi. He was a big chassid, he was Malmidas Tevis, he was a moidendika maskell, and he would say Chassidus Tanya. But the way he said Tanya was very simple. In other words, when the Mashpia said Tanya every day, it was not lumdis, it was not higher levels of understanding, it was pshat, poshet the pshat in the Tanya, he would say. So the story was as follows, that in Lubavitch there was a bacher whose name was, I believe, Reb Gershon Simpson. Reb Gershon Simpson had a physical illness. And because of his physical illness, it was important for him to get fresh air. And the doctors told him every day for half an hour he has to walk in the forests outside of the great metropolis of Lubavitch. But the schedule was so tight he couldn't find time. He had an older brother who was we knew him. I didn't know him personally, but he lived here in America, a very big chassid. One of the great Tmeim, his name was Rabbi Simpson, Rabbi Simpson al-Vashol. So Reb Gershon Simpson said to his older brother, what should I do? They're saying I should take off a half an hour. Which half an hour should I take? So his older brother told him, listen, you've been learning in Lubavitch a few years. Tanya should get merit all. If you every day had a half an hour of Tanya, and the whole shir was, Chumash Midrashi, if you in yeshiva 2 or 3 years, you heard the Tanya 4 or 5 times. It was very quick. They covered a lot of ground. When I was in Old Teda, we didn't have Tanya every day. We had Tanya once a week. But in a half an hour, Rabbi L'chaim could learn 3 prakim. He would learn very fast. He would read and teach. So Rabbi Simpson said to his brother that you should take off the half an hour of Tanya. So he did. 7 o'clock, he would disappear from the Beis HaMedrash and he would go take a walk. The Mashgiach of Chassidus was a Pshilim, a moidendika oived, a big chassid, something very, very special. And Abshilim notices that every day at 7 o'clock, Gershon Simpson leaves the Beis Medrash. So he calls him over and he asks him, what's this? So he tells him that the doctor said he has to take a walk every day, half an hour. And he talked it over with his big brother, the Geisa Chassid. And his brother said, Tanya, you've heard before. So take off the half an hour of Tanya. And Abshilim said, no. Take off any half an hour of the day, but the half an hour of Tanya you gotta be. He says, why? I heard it 5 times already. If I'm not gonna hear it a 6th time, what's gonna happen to me? And Abshilim said, no. Take off any half an hour of the day, but the Tanya mustazan, you have to be by Tanya. So he went to his older brother and says, the Mashgiach is being unreasonable, and he's saying that I have to be by Tanya. Go talk to him. So Rabbi Eli Simpson went over to the Mashgiach, and he said to him, what are you bothering my brother about? He's got to take off half an hour. He was to Tanya many times. And Abshilim told Rabbi Simpson the same thing. Take off any half hour a day, but to Tanya mustazan, you have to be by Tanya. He said, but it doesn't make any sense. He heard the Tanya so many times. There's no nayas. He reads words and translates. It's foolish. If he takes a different half an hour, he's losing time of learning. And this, he's losing time from a chazar. And the Muslim said, you know what? You're from the Chayzrim. He tells Rabbi Simpson, you're from the Chayzrim. Shabbos morning, 8 o'clock in the morning, they would go into the Rebbe Rashab for the chazar of the Maimer. When you'll be by the Rebbe, Shabbos morning, you'll ask him. So Chazara came, and all the Chayzim, it was not a lot of Bachrim, a handful of Bachrim went in, And the Iked Rosh HaChoizim was talking that same Mashgiach, Rabbi Shilom, he was the head of the Chayzim. He had a very, very good memory. He was a Meirindik and Mistageya. The Alter Simchovich, who was himself a giant, said about the Pshilim that he's a witness that had gedient the Meibishten ad wieviel a mensch kenner. Imagine, Rabbi Alter Simchovich, who was a very big Ovid, said about the Pshilim, he served Hashem as hard as it's humanly possible to serve. He couldn't do more, which is unbelievable. So they went into Chazorah, and Rabbi Simson went over to the Rebbe Rashab, and he told him the situation. That his brother has to take a walk, his younger brother, and he told him to take the half an hour of Tanya, because Tanya he heard a few times already. And the Mashgiach, Reb Shilom, says, no, you take any half an hour, but the half an hour of Tanya you gotta be. So he says to the Rebbe Rashab, meet Tzadok, who's right, what should I do? So the Rebbe Nishma Seidin said, der Mashgiach is gerecht. The Mashgiach is right. So Tanya darf man sein. When they teach Tanya, you have to be there. Tanya habe ich nicht gemacht, man soll nehmen in Peckel. I heard this from the Pidya, for sure. Tanya, I did not make to take something and put it in your pocket. In other words, it's not about new information. It's about the inyan that you're learning Tanya every day. So I try to follow this Heirah. Sunday is Tanya. I almost never interrupt the Tanya. No matter what else is going on, we interrupt a lot of other things, but Tanya, b'lineh, that I try not to interrupt. So now that I told you a story and I ate up some clock, let's learn some Tanya. We're in the middle of Periketes, chapter 19. Technically, we're on page Chavdal Amud Beis, that means page 48. And we're going to start from the word V'hu Hepech. Hepech is the first word on the line. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
Can you repeat what?
9.
What is it?
It's 9 lines from the bottom of the page.
Which page?
Page Chavdal Amud Beis, page 48. Okay? Until now, we talked about Kedusha. First of all, we talked about Kedusha of the Neshama. And then we talked about Klal B'chol Sitra the Kedusha. It's not just true of the Neshama, but it's true everything. Anything which is in the side of Kedusha has these rules. So first of all, in Tanya chapter 6, in Tanya Perek Vov, the Alter Rebbe discusses Sitra the Kedusha. And he says that Sitra the Kedusha is Kol Masha Batel Etli Yisbarach. The trademark of Kedusha is Bittel. Kedusha is something that if you would meet her, if you would meet him, if you would meet it, its identity wouldn't be itself, its identity would be its source. Kedusha is Batel, but it's a Bittel of Dveikus. In other words, it's not I am and I serve Hashem, I'm nothing other than an expression of HaKadosh Baruch. So it's a Klal B'chol Sitra the Kedusha. Kedusha is Batel. In our Perek, the Alter Rebbe added another dimension to Sitra Kedusha. And the second dimension, which our chapter added to Sitra the Kedusha, is Chochma, Koyach Ma, which means the power of Mesiras Nefesh. That anything which is in the side of Kedusha is prepared to give itself away to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to lose its Metzias totally and completely, even though it's going to stop existing here, and it's also going to stop existing in the market. This is what it wants, betiva, by its nature. And we spent 2 whole classes discussing the word teva. Okay, so Kedusha is batel. Kedusha is ready for sacrificing itself for the sake of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And the Alter Rebbe now says, it's the exact opposite of Klipa V'Sitrach. I want you to know that when we learn Perek Aleph, Tanya chapter 1, I translated each word. You have Klipa, you have Sitrachara, you have Avodah Zarah, and you have Elikim Achedim. We're going to have this mitzvah on Perek Chabeis. And I gave you a separate class. I translated the word Klipa separately. I translated the word Sitra Achara separately. I connected it to the Yin of Avodah Zarah. So we spent a lot of time translating the word Klipa. But when you talk about the word Klipa, just like when you talk about the word Kedusha, there's basically 2 classes. Basically 2 classes. Now, of course, you're listening to me and you're thinking, 2 classes of Klipa, Klipas Noigen, Shalosh Klipas Atmeis. That's what you're thinking, right? But you're wrong. You know already that I'm obsessed, I'm mamish obsessed with the word Teva. In this cycle of Tanya, it's one of the things that I'm never looking over. Another word, by the way, which I'm focusing on in the Tanya, which gets overlooked very often, is the word tumah. Tumah. The word tumah appears in Tanya more often than people else. No one even is mesim lev. But these are sort of, when I learn the Tanya, I'm learning the Tanya more than the first time, and probably more than the second time. But the Tanya never finishes. You never run out of Tanya. The same sefer, there's always more and more. And in this round, this is not really you, this is me. This is where I'm holding in the Tanya. I'm very obsessed with the word teva. So now, let's talk about klipa, right? We know, everybody knows what klipa is. Klipa is called over she'enei batla klipa. The center of klipa is itself. The center of klipa is not the Eibishter. But when you say that klipa's center is itself, there's two levels in klipa also. And they are the teva of klipa and what's lower than the teva of klipa. There's different madrigas of klipa. There's klipas noya, there's shalosh klipas neyas lagamre. But there is how klipas noya has a teva. There is how shalosh klipas atmeyas lagamre has a teva. And there is going lower than the teva. In other words, a kosher food has a teva of klipas nega. A non-kosher food, a terefa animal, has a teva of sholosh klipas atmeyas lagamre. The nefesh abamis of a yid, the animal soul of a Jew, has a teva. What's the teva of the animal soul of a Jew? He wants to enjoy permitted pleasures. He has no inclination to sin. Sin is the neshama of a yid going lower than its teva. And by a goy, it's the same thing. My daughter was very upset at me yesterday when I told her this. We always learn in Tanya that goyim hashal klipat meis lagamre. That's not true. Goyim who don't keep sheva mitzvahs b'nei neach are shalosh klipat meis lagamre. Goyim who keep sheva neach are klipas nega. They're much closer to kedusha. So whatever level of goy you're talking about, goyim have a teva. And the Rebbe writes in his Maimer of Basal Lagan in Tafshin Yud Gimel, which I touched on a few times already, including very recently, that for a goy to do one of the Sheva Avedas of Bnei Neach is exactly the same as for you to do one of the Avedas of the Tayag Mitzvahs. A Yid's Teva, we're talking about Nefesh HaBahamis now, doesn't want to sin. A goy's Teva, and his Nefesh HaBahamis is from Klipa, also doesn't want to sin. For a goy to sin, he has to go lower than his Teva. So when you're talking about Klipa, there's also two classes. There's klipa within its nature, and the nature of klipa is selfish. But the nature of klipa, like it says in Chav Gimel, Chav Dalet, Uf Kudasa Yisbarach Shomer Arucha, klipa has certain parameters, klipa has certain limits, quote, how bad it will be. And when a Yid doesn't have Aveda, or a Havla Goy doesn't have Aveda, they go lower than their Teva. So there's two classes in klipa itself. But before you get to the two classes, let's generalize. The definition of klipa is self-centricity. In other words, if you want to define philosophically, what's the difference in kedusha and klipa? When you meet kedusha, its entire reality is not itself, but its creator. When you meet klipa, its entire reality is itself and not its creator. So kedusha and klipa are opposites. Kedusha is batal Hashem. Kedusha is prepared to give itself away to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, even though it's going to lose its metzias. Mikomo kem kachu retzena b'tiva, by nature, and by klipa it's not that way. Now let's learn. Let's do a little reading. Hey v'hu hey b'ch mamish. It's mamish the opposite. Mebechinas haklip from klipa. Klipa means a peel, a shell that covers over the spark of Hashem that wants to run to Hashem. V'sitra achara, and the other side. The other side means it's not batal to Hashem. Shamimena, of which comes number one, the Fashas Umas Elam, the souls of non-Jews. The Avdin Legamayu, everything they do is for themselves. And by the way, l'cha'ori, you could say the Nefesh HaBahamis of a Yid. Nefesh HaBahamis of it is also Klip and Sitter Achara, but for some reason the Alter Rebbe doesn't include it here. The Amrin and the severe Klipa say, have. Give me. Haliteini, pour it down my throat. You need to say, Klipa's only interest is self. It's totally selfish. Liyesh, because the definition of klipa is to be yesh v'dava b'fnei atzma, yesh, an independent entity, and something unto itself. Kanal, as we discussed before, and l'cha'eda before, means Tanya Peirik Vov, heipech b'chinas ha'chochma, the opposite of chochma. Chochma is bittul. Chochma is even mesiras nefesh, and chochma is bittul, and chochma is mesiras nefesh. B'teva, klipa is the opposite. It doesn't have bittul, it doesn't have mesiras nefesh. Its teva is that its center is self. And therefore, Nikrayim Mesim, Klipa is called death. Chachma is life. Uksiv, the pasuk says alternatively, Yamusu, there is death. When there's no Chachma. So Klipa is called Misa, and Kedusha is called Chaim. Klipa is called death, and Kedusha is called life. Let's read on. When we say that Klipa is death, we're talking about not kosher food, non-Yidden. And the same is true of Klipas Noiga. Klipas is Echad Klipa, but the Alter Rebbe doesn't bring it here. Harashayim with Pesha Yisrael, sinners, evil and sinful Jews, who do Avedis. Kaidem Shabo Lidei Nisayir, before they come to a test. Lekadesh Hashem, to sanctify Hashem's name. Meaning, when a Yid is tested, even if he's a Rasha, when a Yid is pushed to the wall, even if he's a Rasha, the Koyach HaMesiras Nefesh comes out. But when he's not pushed to the wall, and the Koyach HaMesiras does not come out, he's also included with Klip. Why? The point of Chachma in his godly soul, of this Rasha, it means to tell the course with the spark of the divine. In say Baruch of godliness. Hamelubah, which is inside this Rasha, even though he's a Yid, which is inside this Pesha Yisrael, even though he's a Yid, Heim bebechinas Golos, it's exiled begufam in their body. Benefesh Abamas in the animal soul. Mitzad HaKlipa, because of the Klipa, Shebechol Allah Smoli Shebelev, which is in the left ventricle of the heart, Hameleches, which kings, Umeisheles and dominates. Top of page Chav Hey now, please. Begufam over their bodies, beside, according to the mystical secret of Golos HaShechina, the Shechina being exiled, Kana was mentioned earlier. Earlier means chapter 17. So Yid was a Rasha. Until he's tested, until the power of Mesiras Nefesh is touched, his Kedusha is in Golos, and therefore he too is considered a part of Klip. Which is why Nikras Avezu, we talk about a Jew loving Hashem on the level of the Pintel Yid, the Benefesh Alakis, which is in the godly soul. Should attain another chesed that is want and his desire. Is lidaving by the Hashem to attack itself to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Chaya Chayim Baruch Hu, the source of all life. We call it b'shem Ave Mesuteres, a hidden love. A hidden love is like an unfound treasure or an unknown secret. Yeah. If I went over to tell, Moshe, I want to tell you a secret. Okay, what's the secret? I don't know. There's a treasure. Where is it? I don't know. What's what a Chachma does? If you don't have the treasure and you don't know the secret, you have nothing. What does it mean, a hidden love? I either love or I don't. I mean, a hidden love. I love and I don't know. So the Rebbe says, yeah. A treasure that you don't know about isn't yours. A secret that you don't have isn't yours. But a love for the Eibush which you don't know about could be yours because of your neshama. Why is it hidden? So he explains why. Tihi misuteres on the chusva, because this love is blocked and covered over. Bilavush sak the klipa, in the thick garment which constitutes klipa. Bepeshe Yisrael, in sinful Jews. Umimenan, because the neshama of a Yid is covered over in the state of Galus, nichnas behem ruach shtus, the spirit of folly can invade them, take them over. Lachte, and allow them to do Avedis. Kemaimed Azal, the Gemara says, Ein Adam Chete, a person will never do an Aveda unless Ruach Shtus pervades him. So you can have a love and not know about it. A secret that you don't know, you don't have. A treasure that you don't know where it is, you don't have. But love for the Eibush you don't know about, you could know. Why? Because you have two souls. I guess you could say it about a treasure. If there's a treasure in your property, the treasure in your property, and you don't know the treasure's there, it's technically yours. I mean, I don't know what the halachas would be, but it's technically yours because it's your property and you don't know you have it. A Yid loves Hashem and doesn't know it. Why? Because he's a combination of Kedusha and Klipa. And by some people, the Klipa covers over the Kedusha. So the possibility for love is present. The actual love is covered over until you come to a test of Emunah. The touch of Mesiras Nefesh because of the Klipa, and that's why it's called I love Hashem, my love is unknown to me. And I'm going to stop here. Now, Rabbi said there's a lot of things that we just learned in this, I don't know what it is, dozen lines or so. The first thing that we learned, and a lot of the things we learned in these few lines we already had primarily in chapter 6 of Perek Vav. And at the time I explained them to you, in fact, at the time I explained them to you rather lengthy. We spent a lot of time on Klipa So I don't want to spend 5 classes on this, but I do want to touch it. The Rebbe says the difference between Kedusha and Klipa is Kedusha is called living and Klipa is called death. Okay, so if we're making a list, yeah, Kedusha is batal, Klipa is yesh. Kedusha is nature, it's tava, is Mesiris Nefesh. Klipa's nature is self. Kedusha is living and Klipa is death. Or the two expressions which are cited in the Maimorim, and Tanya also mentioned, Tzadikim b'misosam kruyim chayim. I will give you a 1-question test. I know this is fair and rude and insensitive. Where did we have this in Rashi? In Chumash. Tzadikim b'misosam kruyim chayim. A tzaddik, after he passes away, is still alive. Anybody? We had it in Chitas from Bereishis till now. After Simchas Torah. The last Rashi in Noach. Vayom was terach b'choron, because Rishoyim b'chayim kruyim meisim and tzadikim b'misosam k'meisha kosov of the Yob and Yehoda ben Yishchai. It's the last Rashi in Noach. That the tzadikim, after they pass away, are still called living, and they make a knife from a pasuk. And Rishoyim, even when they're alive, are called death. And our Rabbi quoted it in Tanya, Perikid Zayin. So I want to explain this a little bit. The Nukudas Hadav is, the point of it is, the Torah has a very specific definition for the word life. You know, you ask a scientist the definition of the word life, I think even now they are unsure how to define it. They have criteria for something to be alive. They have to be separated from their environment. They have to be able to take in food from their environment and dispose of waste. They have to be able to regenerate their body parts. And last and not least, they have to be able to reproduce. Those are I think it's 5 things. How to define a living thing. And it's pretty constant. But that's not how Torah defines life. The Torah does not define life through biology. Torah says the definition of life is something which is forever. Forever, nitzchi. The definition of death is something which is temporary. The most dominant and powerful entity, if it's not forever while it's living, is called death. The most meek and weak and vulnerable entity, if it's going to live forever, is called living. The definition of life is eternal. And they connect it to the word emes in Kutas Hamayim Maimah Beis. Emes. It says in Chazal, Shiva Hanikroim, Emes. There are 7 that are called Emes. Yidna are called Emes, Torah is called Emes, and the Eibush is called Hashem Hu Elokim Emes, Hu Elokim Chayim. And the pasuk that they bring, that the Eibush is Emes, is the pasuk that says God is the God of truth, God is the God of life, and they use that pasuk as a carryover. Emes means eternal, truth is something which never changes. And since we talk about the Eibush, you call him Emes, and you call them Chayim, in the same pasuk you call them true, and you call them living. In the same pasuk we learn from this that if you're true, you're living. If you're living, you're true. In other words, the definition of life in Torah is a ebikait, something which is forever. And of course, the guf is not forever, the body is not forever, but the neshama is forever. But the neshama is only forever by human beings. The animal souls die. When the body of an animal dies, the soul of the animal dies as well. Only human souls are forever. When the neshama comes into the guf, it's not because of the guf. When the neshama leaves the guf, it doesn't die with the guf. The guf body dies, the soul lives on. The definition of something which is truly living is something which is eternal. What's the source of that? The source of that is attachedness to the chaya yachaya. How about we eternal? We're not eternal because of what we are by ourselves. We're eternal because of our connection to Atzmus and Tzav Baruch Hu, to the living God, to the Elikim Chayim. So last week, at the end of the class, I told you my mashal. I invented this mashal. It's so pathetic, but it's true. I thought this mashal through 30 years ago when I started teaching kids Tanya, and I repeated it many times, and it's so interesting to me. I told you the mashal last week, and I was ashamed of myself. Like when I came up with this mashal, I thought it was the greatest mashal man ever thought up. But now I feel like it's so chitzoniistic. But I'm going to repeat the mashal again. I'm going to tell you what I said last week. Last week I was in a rush This week I'm going to spend time. I want to repeat the mashal for you. The purpose for bringing this point up is to explain this statement, that the difference in Kedusha and Klipa, besides for the differences we learned about in previous weeks, is that Kedusha is called Chayim, Kedusha is connected to Chochmah and it's called living, and Klipa is not connected to Chochmah and it's called Maves, it's called death. So this is the story. There was once upon a time there was a king. And this king built a powerful kingdom. What is a king's first job? What is the king's very, very first responsibility? The very first thing that a king needs to do for his subject, above all else and before all else? The answer is a king has to protect his citizens. The first role of any king is to keep his borders safe, to protect his country. If you can't protect your borders, everything else you do is also, it's all b'di'evet. You raise a lot of money, they're going to take it from you, you never had it. A king protects his borders, then inside those borders he can build a nation. Education, roads, an economy, culture, all kinds of things that make a kingdom into a kingdom. The problem with this king is he does it so well. It's a large country, a lot of natural resources, and he's a very powerful armies, and he builds very, very fortified borders. And as the expression from one of our former presidents, you have to carry a big stick and talk softly. If the stick is big, you don't have to raise your voice. You talk very softly, but listen, because you're holding a big stick. You have to have an army, so you don't have to use it. You have to have weapons, so you don't have to use them. And he builds an incredibly great and powerful nation. And at one point, the king is bored. He's bored. It's so easy. He built his kingdom. He fortified the borders. He built infrastructure. He built roads. He built schools. He built hospitals. He created an economy. Everybody's doing wonderful. Everybody loves him. What am I going to do now? So the king decides to make an experiment. By the way, terrible idea, but this is what he tries to do. He calls in two of his closest people. Right? The way the story goes, one of them is his son, and one of them is his best friend. Right? One is called David, another one's called Yerav Menavad. And he calls the two of them in and says, listen here, I'm your king. I've been your king for a long time. And Hashem, our country right now is so stable and so prosperous and so self-sustaining that I'm literally out of a job. I have nothing to do. So I'm going to play a game, but a game that's mamish nefoshes. It's a game of life and death. A game of, they say chicken or Russian roulette. The game is this. I am going to divide my kingdom in half. I'm giving half to you, my son, and half to you, my best friend, but I'm not dividing it evenly. To my best friend, I'm giving 90% of the land, 90% of the natural resources, 90% of the army, 90% of the economy, 90% of the infrastructure. But after I give you this largesse, after I give you these gifts, you're on your own, you have to build your own kingdom. Then it turns to his son, who's now shaking hand and foot, and says, I'm giving 10% of the land, and 10% of the army, and 10% of the natural resources, and 10% of the infrastructure, but I'm with you. You're going to run the country. Anytime you need, you can consult me. Now, the king doesn't ask them, he tells them, this is what we're doing. So the next day, they make that whole kingdom into Berlin. They put up a brick wall. On this side you have prosperity, on this side you have depressionness and dreary colors and the whole thing, you're based on how the people talk about Berlin. And these two kings now began to run their respective countries. The son of the king is at huge disadvantage. It's a small army, it's a small country. Okay, there's a wall between him and his neighbor, but walls can be breached. And he runs to his father and he says, what am I going to do if they decide to attack me? So the king says, first of all, they're not going to attack so quick. It'll take a while. Second of all, they will attack eventually. And your job is to create a nucleus within your 10%, a 10% within that percentage you're never going to give up. You're going to hold on to it no matter what. And the king advises his son what to do in case of attack. What's happening on the other side of the wall? This man is given a huge kingdom with so much wealth. But he's not a king. He's not a Reis HaNever. So he announces a moratorium on work. As they gave the mice. 6 months, like a Swedish. 6 months nobody worked. And there's a Fabrengen, men Estum, men Trinktem, and Hot on the state. The government gives people an extended vacation until they're all drunk and fat and lazy and indulged. Huh? Why? They can afford it. And at the end of that period, okay, now the party is over, people have to go back to work. And of course, it's a big country, it's been successful for a long time, things continue. But the precision, the preciseness, the exactness that the king invested in running this country is missing. And things start to slowly corrode. The roads are getting weaker, they're not fixed right away. The schools are getting poorer, no one's paying attention. The economy begins to slip and slide and saying, okay, it's still not so bad, it's still not so bad. And over the course of many, many years, the fact that a lot of the wealth was wasted and that there is not a constant attention to every single detail starts to show its wear and tear. The country is beginning to come apart. It lacks strong leadership. It lacks vision. It lacks the king who invests in his country in what they call in the culture in a sustainable way, that the country should remain forever, indefinitely. So you understand what happens? One country is very small, and they're working very, very hard to protect their borders and to build the country as best as they could and to anticipate attack when it's going to come. And the other country is slowly becoming less precise, less focused, less constructive, less exact, less self-preserving, until it reaches a point where the people start to feel the crunch, right? The government handouts are not coming anymore, the government can't afford it. Or the government has huge debt. You can understand yourself, right? Use your imagination for what happens to a country that has poor leadership or overconfident leadership that believes we're going to be here forever, how the country begins to come to pieces. The people come to their new king and say, Your Majesty, in the last 25 years since you took over, we thought it did well. But slowly but surely, the roads are getting worse, and the schools are getting worse, and the army is getting weaker, on and on and on and on. What should we do? So the king, the new king, doesn't have the foresight of his king. So he says we have to try and fix this or this or this. But if you don't have seichel and you don't appreciate balance, anything you fix this, you ruin 5 other things. Until finally they come up with the easiest solution. What does the person do when he has a problem internally? If he's a mensch, he addresses it. If he's not a mensch, he deflects it outward. If I have an issue and I don't want to deal with it, I blame it on the world. He says, you know what? They're doing well. That little tiny country next to us that got 10% of the resources and 10% of the land and they seem to be doing fine. There must be some trick. We were somehow tricked. Let's attack. So they attack. They're a bigger country with a greater army, so the smaller country retreats. But you can understand, if you play this movie out long enough, you'll understand what's going to happen. The country without a connection to a wise leader corrodes and corrodes and corrodes. You can blame the whole world. And it implodes. It self-destructs. And the teeny and tiny little country, because it's got good counsel, eventually takes over the whole world. That's the moshel, you understand? And the nimshel is the Eibishter created Shivim Sodom, 70 malachim. Each one of the 70 malachim are the life of one nation. Now, in Chumash, we get the impression that all of these nations exist at the same time. If you look in Parashas Noach, after the Mabul, Shem has children, Yefes has children, and Chom has children. If you'll count up the names, it's exactly 70 names. Because the 70 names in Parashas Noach are not people. You think they're people, they're actually countries, they're nations. The Shivim Umes are written by name individually. Kasruchim and Kaslusim and Patrusim and Achveisnedvos, Plishtim and Kafteirim, every one of the 70 names mentioned in Parashas Noach is actually a nation. I told this to you before. I don't know if I'm right, but Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan has a Chumash. Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan relies a lot, all of Hashalom, on what's called the Septuagint, the Targum Shivim. The oldest translation of the Tanakh was the translation of Tanakh into Greek that was made during the times of the second Beis HaMikdash. There's implication that it was done more than once. But it was forced by the Egyptian Greek rulers, by the Ptolemean kings. So the Gemara says that they made certain changes, but the Gemara lists 12 changes. Otherwise, they translate it exactly as it's written. So he relies heavily on this Targum, and on that basis he identifies where the 70 nations are, and he even speculates as to where they were on the map, where they were in the ancient world, where they were on the map. If you take a look at Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan's Chumash, it's called the Living Torah. In Parshas Noach he has a map where he says where each of the 7 nations are, and oftentimes he has question marks, he's uncertain. It's based on his accepting the Targum Shirim, the oldest translation of Tanakh, which was made in Greek, against the Rashi of the Chachamim. He trusts that if they have no reason to mistranslate, they translated it accurately, and he therefore presumes that those 70 nations are right now. So technically, all 70 nations always exist. Today in the United Nations, I think there's over 200 countries. But halachically, in Torah, there's 70 nations. But there's also a phenomenon called empire. Explain empire how you wish, but basically empire means each one of these 70 nations has a bright day in the sun. Egypt had a bright day in the sun. Greece had a bright day in the sun. Rome had a bright day in the sun. Russia had a bright day in the sun. Germany had a bright day in the sun. Every one of the 70 nations is a period. Germany is what's called the Holy Roman Empire. Germany means Germany and France, and what's in between Germany and France, the Low Countries. Charlemagne, it was a great empire. Every one of the 70 nations has a period of time when it does very, very well. And I told you last week, one of the 70 nations is Poland. And I told you the story with the Alter Rebbe, that at one point the Yidden had to move from one Gauls to another, and no nation wanted to take them because they knew what the Jews are going to do. They're going to come to that country, they're going to take all the wealth, and they're going to leave. And Poland said, I'll take the Jews, and therefore the Alter Rebbe said, Poland means the Malach of Poland. Whenever Poland gives us a financial tax, we have to pay it. As they've been agreed, we agreed to pay taxes to them, to give them tribute. But each one of the 70 nations has a day in the sun. And then they wane and then they die. And the Jew is forever. And again, last week also, when I had this conversation with you, I told you about Mark Twain's page. When I teach it to my high school boys, I push it, bring in the page, where Mark Twain wrote a long essay, which is quite anti-Semitic. But at the end of this long essay, has a famous paragraph. Every Jew knows it. He writes about the Jewish people. He says, the Jew is a very old nation. And he's a very successful nation. Considering his population, his numbers, he far exceeds his bulk in terms of his contributions in math and in science and in business and in medicine and in abstract thinking, on and on and on. He risks every kind of milah. And he writes, and the Jews have seen all the great empires come, the Babylonians, the Greeks, the Egyptians. He says, he's seen them all. He survived them all. And they're all gone. And he is what he always was, showing no infirmities of his parts, no weakening of his sharp mind. Mark Twain was a brilliant writer. And he finishes this one paragraph with the words, what is the secret of his immortality? This is very, you Google the Jew, you'll find it right away. The Jew, Mark Twain, it'll come up. It's one paragraph, it's beautiful. And he described it objectively, as a Chagoy, that Yidden have been through the ringer many times, and all of the great empires of the world, one way or another, in Lashon HaTorah, either through Mitzrayim, which is goals of Aeneas, by making us suffer, or Asher, goals of Ashidas, by trying to assimilate us, have tried to destroy us. They're gone and we're still here. And he finishes the paragraph with the words, what is the secret of his? Why are we an eternal nation? He doesn't answer the question. And the answer is, we're an eternal nation because we're attached to the eternal God. That's all. We're not better than anybody else. We're really not. The Rebbe says that. The Rebbe does not believe the Jews are superior genetically. The Yidden are special because that's the only reason. Hashem chose us, and He's living, and He's giving us this property of life. He lives and we live. And life, by definition, means someone that lives forever. That's why there's an Inyan of Tchias HaMeisim. Tchias HaMeisim is important because Tchias HaMeisim means that really, even when a person dies, he doesn't die. He's an Inyan Nitzchi. Because anything which is living, which means it's connected to the living God, is ultimately forever. So now you understand what Alter Rebbe writes here. One of the basic definitions or distinctions And we're going to have it again in Mitzvah Perek Chavbeis. I'll probably talk about it again in Chavbeis. Which if I guess is Yamel, yeah? Now we're holding Yotes, which Yotes and Chavbeis will be 2 years. If I guess we had it earlier. We mentioned in Perek Yitzayin and Perek Vov. That the difference between Kedusha and Klippa is called living and Klippa is called death. Kedusha, even when it's dead, it's alive. Because it's long as attached to the Eibush that it still exists, even if you do not see it. Klippa, even when it's alive, it's dead, because if it's not attached to the Eibush, if something which is temporary, if it's going to die tomorrow, it's philosophically not here even now. So the Alter Rebbe says, this is the difference between Kedusha and Klippa. Kedusha is bottled to the Eibush, Kedusha is ready for Mesiras Nefesh, Kedusha is living, and Klippa is none of the above. It's not bottled to the Eibush, it's certainly ready for Mesiras Nefesh, and it's called death. B'chayayim kriyim mesim, even while it lives, it's already considered misa. And the Rebbe says, what's in that category? Klippa. What's in that category? A yid who does Avedis before his neshama is woken up. The Shoyim with Peish Yitzol, Kedim Shbayim, then you saw it. But Vada Amunah by the Shem HaChag, when they're sleeping or they're exiled in Golos, they're also Klippa. Questions or comments? And I meant it that time. Questions or comments? Or to say it in other words, a yid can be alive and dead at the same time. The chitzonius is mavis, but the nekuda is always chaim. And we'll talk about the Mitzvah Hashem next Sunday. Any other questions or comments? Okay, we're going to stop now.